Notre dernière table ronde, ça va être dur d'être aussi passionné que les étudiants qu'on vient d'entendre, mais on va essayer. So we heard about the perspectives from the students. Now we're going to hear about the perspectives from the teachers, the profs who are involved in those university-level immersion programs. So we have 4 panelists with us today. The first 2 at the end are both from here, and they teach in the French Immersion Studies program. So one is a content prof, the other one is a language prof, and they'll introduce themselves later. And then we have 2 other professors, one from Campus Saint-Jean and one from Simon Fraser. So we have different contexts, we'll have different experiences, but maybe it would be interesting to go back to the ideas that were presented yesterday about collaboration between content and language profs, and integration of language and content or discipline or knowledge, whatever we want to call that. But donc je vais d'abord vous laisser vous présenter.
Bonjour à tous, mon nom est Rémi Légère, c'est écrit léger mais dit légère parce que je suis acadien. Je suis professeur de sciences politiques à l'université Simon Fraser. Ma langue maternelle, c'est le français. J'ai fait mon bac en français à l'université de Moncton. J'ai fait une maîtrise bilingue au campus Saint-Jean de l'université de l'Alberta. Et j'ai fait un doc en anglais à Queen's University où j'ai failli m'assimiler à l'anglais. Parce qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup de français à Kingston et à Queen's. Et après, je suis venu à Ottawa brièvement faire un postdoc. Et depuis Ottawa, je suis en Colombie-Britannique dans une université de langue anglaise, mais j'enseigne la science politique en français dans ce French Cohort Program.
Et je m'appelle Simone Desilets. Je suis franco-albertaine qui vient d'un petit village francophone au nord-est de l'Alberta. Mais je travaille au campus Saint-Jean, qui est le campus francophone de l'Université de l'Alberta. Alors, au campus Saint-Jean, on s'appelait autrefois la faculté Saint-Jean. Mais comme nous avons plusieurs programmes qui mènent à un bac, on a choisi de changer le nom de l'institution au campus Saint-Jean. Alors, au campus Saint-Jean, on peut faire nos études dans un programme de bac en sciences, un programme de bac en éducation, en art. On peut faire aussi un bac en administration des affaires, un bac en sciences infirmières. Il y a aussi un programme de maîtrise dont Rémi a mentionné. Et pour l'instant, la plupart de ces programmes-là s'offrent entièrement en français, mais pas toutes. Et on voit justement l'étudiante Laurence, qui était assise ici tantôt, qui nous a expliqué qu'elle est dans un programme de sciences, une science pure, qui mène à un diplôme qui va l'amener, selon son choix, d'être admise en pharmacie. Alors, pour elle, c'est pas possible de prendre tous ses cours en français. J'enseigne, moi, en pédagogie, en éducation. Mes étudiants sont des étudiants qui sont dans leur dernière année d'une formation de 4 ans, qui vont enseigner principalement dans les écoles d'immersion en Alberta et ailleurs. J'enseigne des cours de didactique et aussi un cours de communication et gestion de classe qui est surtout comment gérer les difficultés de comportement chez nos étudiants. Je suis une finissante du campus Saint-Jean en 1980, lorsqu'on appelait ça un collège Saint-Jean, qui venait tout récemment d'être affilié à l'Université de l'Alberta. Donc, je faisais partie d'une des premières cohortes qui finissait au campus Saint-Jean. On était un groupe de 7 étudiants qui finissaient en éducation en 1980.
OK, merci.
Bonjour, my name is Robert Talbot. I think the context is worth providing. I'm an Anglophone originally from Saskatchewan, graduate of the French immersion myself. My parents drank the Trudeau Kool-Aid back in the 80s, and so Trudeau Père, that is. And so I had the good fortune of going through that program. My mother was engaged in Canadian Parents for French. And then I did my undergrad here at the University of Ottawa, and I guess fulfilled that K to 16, I guess, if you will, French, or French immersion, so to speak. Et j'enseigne aussi maintenant à temps partiel comme professeur d'histoire ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. And I also work for the Commission for Official Languages as a policy analyst But in this capacity, I'm wearing my hat as a part-time prof. So if I say anything untoward, it's definitely in that capacity. Et c'est ça. Merci.
Merci.
Et moi, c'est Alice Weinberg. Vous m'avez peut-être déjà rencontrée ici. Je suis professeure à l'Institut des langues officielles et du bilinguisme. Moi, je suis professeure de français. J'accompagne les étudiants qui sont en immersion et je donne ces cours d'encadrement linguistique dont on a entendu parler à plusieurs reprises hier et aujourd'hui. Et j'ai commencé dans cette voie dès les premiers cours qui ont été offerts avant même la création du régime d'immersion, dès 2005, la première expérimentation, et depuis 2006, donc j'accompagne des étudiants, en particulier dans le programme d'histoire, dans le département d'histoire. Et j'ai eu différentes expériences dont je parlerai plus tard avec les professeurs d'histoire. Donc, c'est aussi à ce titre qu'on forme une sorte d'équipe, Robert et moi. Donc, on représente les deux tenants du professeur de discipline et de langue.
She's the better half.
Is it the language, the part-time prof speaking, or the? Okay, so we have described the model that's being used here, so I won't spend too much time on that. You know that for each content or discipline course, there is a specific language support class, which is why we have our two professors here. But I'm going to let our two other panelists give a little bit of background information or the structure of their program and their respective roles in them.
En anglais? OK.
Oh, comme tu veux.
Ah, OK. Vous voyez la même. OK. Quel est le modèle d'immersion dans notre institution? Je vous dirais que la réponse courte, c'est que nous n'avons pas un modèle d'immersion au campus Saint-Jean. Et c'est peut-être aussi pourquoi Laurence avait une difficulté à répondre à la première question quand elle a dit, bien, je suis pas sûre si c'est de l'immersion ou ça me semble pas comme de l'immersion, c'est plutôt francophone, je pense. Et c'est peut-être en raison de un peu de l'historique du campus Saint-Jean. C'est que le campus Saint-Jean a été fondé il y a plus de 100 ans comme un collège qui desservait les jeunes garçons francophones de l'Alberta. So it was originally started as a francophone boys' school, where the boys, it was run by the Catholic priests, the Oblates, and so the boys would come to Campus Saint-Jean to finish their high school. And it eventually evolved into many things. And so today, are we an immersion institution, or are we an anglophone or francophone? What are we exactly? De ma perspective, on est une institution francophone. Et vraiment, bien que notre clientèle ait changé énormément durant les années, je crois que le modèle d'enseignement ou de notre programme d'enseignement est plutôt un modèle francophone. Maintenant, si je reviens à ce que M. Caillot disait hier, pour voir sa description des modes, je dirais que le campus Saint-Jean suit plutôt le mode numéro 1, qui était le mode monolingue ou endolingue, c'est-à-dire we have no linguistic issues, no didactic issues. Alors, on suit plutôt ce modèle-là comme modèle d'enseignement. Ceci étant dit, étant donné que notre population a tellement changé, évidemment, ça apporte bien des défis pour nous. Jusqu'à l'instant, je pense qu'on pourrait vous dire que les enseignants ne font pas de modifications ou d'adaptations dans leur enseignement, mais ça pose des problèmes, ça aussi. Alors, j'aborderai la question de modification à ce programme francophone ou dit francophone dans la deuxième partie du discours.
Well, my response is actually quite similar. I applied for this position at SFU about 5 years ago now, and when I applied for the position was advertised as teaching political science. en français at Simon Fraser University. So I applied for the position, interviewed, and I was the one that was fortunately hired and moved to Simon Fraser to teach political science in French. And very quickly, meaning very quickly on the first day of class, I realized that most of my students had French as an additional language. And so I've been thrown into this world of plurilingual education and tri-languaging and different pedagogies to try to adapt my teaching. So in terms of the model, I think that our program is much smaller than Campus Saint-Jean at the U of A, but in terms of the program, it's a French cohort program, and the teaching is delivered in French, and we don't distinguish between the students that have French as a first language as an additional language. Now that said, as a professor, as an instructor in this program, I've tried to make some changes to my teaching to try to adapt to the student clientele. And also the Office of Francophone Affairs at SFU, and the director is here, Claire Trépanier. She spoke yesterday. The office provides informal support, formal support to the students. And so very quickly, some of the things that are offered to the students in terms of support, there are the cliniques de langue, so these kind of workshops that are offered for students on a regular basis. These are not mandatory; these are optional for the students. So often you have the keeners, the students probably that need it less, that attend these workshops to improve their French. And probably the main measure that we've instituted, actually that was instituted before I arrived at SFU, is what we called la double correction. And so students, especially in first and second year courses, will submit their papers to me, but I just bring the copies to a corrector, un correcteur linguistique, and this person will go through their papers and not look at substance, but look at language, and will make a series of recommendations. So sometimes the students get their copies back with a lot of red ink, and I have to tell them not to worry, that this first initial submission actually has no value in terms of what the final grade that they get in the class. So the first submission is then returned to the students with some recommendations on changes to bring about to the language. And then the second submission, the submission that I actually grade, naturally, if the students spend time actually making the changes that were recommended, is better, and the student gets a grade on that second copy. And my colleagues that have been at SFU for longer tell me that this was instituted because les profs s'arrachaient les cheveux, right? Like actually profs were having a hard time figuring out if the problem was a language problem or if it was a content comprehension problem. So this measure was instituted, and now it's become the new norm, especially in our lower level courses.
Okay. So there are different models at work in your different institutions, and there are consequences on you as professor on what you can do in class, on what you have to do in class. So can you talk about the impact of the model or absence of model on what you have to do? Yeah, I guess you just mentioned a few, like double correction and a few things you change in your teaching. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, all of you?
Yeah, so I'll say quickly that I'm not trained in any of this stuff, right? I'm trained in political science throughout. I spent 11 years. I spent 11 years studying political science, and then I was hired to teach political science in French, as I said. And then very quickly, on the first day, I realized that what the student clientele was, and then I've had to make changes over the last 5 years or so. So I'm certainly not a philosopher or a thinker of French immersion or of plurilingual education. But some of the changes that I've tried to make in my specific courses is that at the 100 and 200 level, I try to almost exclusively assign French language scholarship. I think that it's important for the students that if they're going to acquire a literacy, an academic literacy in political science in French, that it's going to come from my courses. the English language poli-sci courses that they take with my colleagues are certainly not going to have French language scholarship in those classes. So in the first couple of years, but that's just a rule that I kind of have for myself. Some of my colleagues operate differently, but for me, I think it's very important, especially at the 100 and 200 level, to have exclusively or almost exclusively French language scholarship. The second thing that I'll mention is that I lecture in French. I think that's a given, but I'll say it. I lecture in French. However, in first and second year, again, I will always give key concepts and key terms to the students in English. So on my slide, I will have the term in French, and also I will have the term in English. And I think that that enables the students to build on knowledge that they have. They may know the term, the terminology, the concept in English, or they may have heard of it, they may have read it in the media. But they don't necessarily have the concept in French. And so to help them make that connection between, unfortunately, I don't speak Mandarin. Most of my students speak Mandarin, or at least half of them. I don't speak Mandarins, but if I did, I would put the Mandarin term up there as well, in order for them to be able to build on the different languages and the knowledge that they have in these different languages. The third thing I will say is that I ask my students to try to speak French in class, especially in first and second year, where it might be a bit of a challenge for them. So I do ask them and I do encourage them to start in French whenever that they want to participate, either to make a comment or to ask a question, but I tell them that it's fine if they don't feel comfortable continuing on or finishing their question or their comment in French, and I encourage them to turn to English to finish their thought. And what happens then is that the student will start in French and then will switch to English to finish the question that he or she may want to ask, and then I do the translation myself of the question back to French in the hope that the students then learn the vocabulary in French as well, so that next time around, or in 2 weeks' time, or next term when I see these students again, there's not many professors, so I see the students a lot, that they are more comfortable asking the question exclusively in French or mostly in French. And lastly, this is mostly at the 100, 200 level. As the former French cohort program student said, who was here earlier, Bruno, who's now a law student here at the U of O, in third year, the students go on exchange, and when they come back from exchange, they mostly come to Quebec or Europe. When they come back, it's quite fantastic to see them, because all of a sudden they're more comfortable in French than I am. And in those third and fourth year courses, they're more advanced courses, so everything happens in French in these courses. The students don't have to revert back to English. Really, French is the language of the lecture, of the classroom. But in those courses, because they're more advanced courses, and you do know that a lot of scholarship is only available in English, I would say that in my advanced courses, the scholarship is mostly 50-50. So the readings that we do are 50 in French and about 50 in English, but our discussion is in French, the students participate in French, everything in the classroom happens in French.
Can I ask you to clarify two things? I don't
Sure.
know if it's just for me, but maybe also for our audience. What do you mean exactly by French scholarship?
Des publications en français.
Okay, so course material, readings, books, stuff like that?
French, la littérature en français, est-ce qu'il y a des articles en français, des chapitres en
merci.
français?
Ok. Ma deuxième question, c'est dans vos classes, est-ce qu'il y a aussi des francophones ou est-ce que c'est uniquement des allophones?
J'y reviens un peu plus tard là-dessus, mais la très grande majorité de mes étudiants, ce sont des étudiants qui ont fait l'immersion française en Colombie-Britannique. Mais à chaque année, c'est une cohorte de 25 étudiants, et à chaque année, il y a une poignée d'étudiants, quelques étudiants, 2-3 étudiants, qui sont issus des écoles de langue française en Colombie-Britannique. Okay. Mais ça ne veut pas forcément dire qu'ils sont plus confortables en français que les étudiants qui ont fait l'immersion. C'est le contexte de la Colombie-Britannique.
Ouais, OK, merci beaucoup.
Je vais peut-être suivre sur les mêmes lignes. Our student population at Campus Saint-Jean is about 65% from the French Immersion program, coming from primarily Alberta, but also from across Canada. The next biggest population are international students who speak French. Some it's their first, and for others it's their second or third language. We have quite a number of students who come from Francophone African countries, mostly the Congo, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Rwanda, Togo, Senegal, etc. Those are the countries that are represented at our campus in that group. And then the smallest group is the les francophones that we call the Souche, either from Alberta or from all over Canada. So that's the smallest population. And so because there is a lack of a formal immersion program or francophone program at Campus Saint-Jean, what you've described, Remy, is similar to what some of my colleagues use as well, as in terms of strategies to best meet the needs of the students at Campus Saint-Jean. Some are steadfast about speaking French only, expecting good quality written work, and not ever distinguishing between, if you're first language, second language, or third language Francophone. It means, of course, that the students have complained a lot and said, well, then we need help. Please help us. You want us to come here and we want to come, but what can you provide for some form of support for us to be able to function well and especially to achieve the degree that we've come here to get. And so we've developed various supports. One is Le Centre d'écriture bilingue, which is a place where the students can book a time for one-on-one help in French. And so some of them will come in just to have a dialogue with someone who is working at the Centre d'éducation, le Centre d'écriture bilingue. And sometimes they'll bring in an assignment and they'll say, can you help me correct this? And so there are various forms of help that they are able to get there. We try to incorporate also within the student life many social activities that will encourage them to hear French, encourage them to speak French. But we have certain challenges there as well because they don't always speak French when they're given the occasion to do so. Some of our professors, in trying to accommodate, especially in the first and second year courses, will tell the students, okay, I've taken marks away from this assignment because of the quality of the French. However, if you can go to Le Centre d'écriture bilingue and come back to show proof that you have made an effort and you have attempted at least to improve, to understand where you've made these mistakes and how you're able to correct them the next time, I'll give you those marks back. And so some professors will do that as well. There are very few of my colleagues, however, who will teach at any time in English. They will stick to French unless perhaps in some of your science courses, and I'm not familiar with some of those because I teach in the education department, but in the education department, we typically stick to French all the time. We will sometimes give the English word if we're talking about something, a technicality or a strategy, a teaching strategy of some sort. We'll give the English word, but basically we're teaching and working completely in French. In the fourth year courses that I teach, I use French only. I will not distinguish between those who are first and second language learners in my classroom. As a department, the entire education department at one point said, let's ensure then that there is some consistency within the department in terms of quality of French in the assignments. And so we said that we would include in the evaluation of all the assignments a 10% of all the evaluations would be given to the quality of French. And we've devised a correction table, and so we follow the same correction table, and then the students can lose up to 10% of their mark on any given assignment as a result of the quality of French that they've used. And so this encourages them to go to le Centre d'écriture bilingue, to use Antidote, as was mentioned by one of the students on the panel just before us. We've installed Antidote and other Francophone technology programs on all the computers at Campus Saint-Jean, so they don't have to buy these very costly programs. They can run their assignments on these computers to try to at least pick up on some of these mistakes that are fairly common. And so we're trying to support them in that way. But there's really no sort of set practice by the people at Campus Saint-Jean on a sort of across the board.
Is there any focus on language per se in the classroom, or is it done primarily outside of the classroom with le Centre d'écriture bilingue and things like that?
About French, qu'est-ce que tu veux dire?
Language, focus on language. Like vocabulary or whatever. Like we're trying to, how language and content are articulated. Is there any focus on, vocabulary or?
Well, we're just starting to examine that. And recently we were asked to identify the course objectives in our syllabus where we can at least touch on that. Where within our course can we at least incorporate a language component to at least make sure that all of us are incorporating, learning the language within the context of our actual course. Okay. It's just beginning.
Okay, merci.
Yes, my experience bears some similarity to that of Simone. At the University of Ottawa, I teach either in English or I teach in French. And never the twine shall meet, I guess, at least officially. I think when I teach in French, as an Anglophone too, I'm very conscious, I like to think, I'm conscious of the need to create a French language space for Francophone students who are taking the course in French. So I make sure the lecture is entirely in French, of course, and all of the readings are in French for a French class. If a class is in English, then the lectures are entirely in English, and all of the readings are in English, and that's how I teach it. I will use for example, in a French course, if I'm quoting a historical actor, for example, I might, and the quote is in English, I'll read it out in English, and then I might paraphrase in French. Using English is also useful as a humoristic tool. If the spirit moves me and I feel the need to cuss, I can do it in English in a French class, and then it doesn't count, right? But that rarely happens. That rarely happens. Or you can play with words too. One of my favorite words in French is mutation. Mutation. These two words mean very different things in English and French, and so. Either one, in English, you're talking mutation, you're talking about the X-Men. In French, mutation, you're talking about the gradual evolution of a thing. And I find using little inflections of English in a French course, if I allow myself that, or little inflections of French in an English course for a bit of humor, to wake people up, to get their attention, is useful as a pedagogical tool. Another thing, so I teach the course I teach in French. I teach it in French. It's a French content course, so that's how I teach it. But I am conscious that there are immersion students in the room. If I had to guess, I'd say about 80% of students, 85% are French first official language students. But I'm conscious there are Anglophones or immersion students in the class, and often what I'll do on the very first day of a class, I'll say, how many people are from this part of the country? How many people are Anglophones? How many people are Francophones? And then, the Anglophones put their hands up, and then they identify, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not the only immersion student in the class. I also, just as a general pedagogical approach, I try to create an inviting atmosphere. If someone gives, I try to engage my students. If they give a response in a very halting French, I never correct someone's French. First of all, I'm an Anglophone from Saskatchewan, so who am I to do that? Second of all, there are a few things that are more discouraging as an Anglophone speaking French than being corrected at every couple moments. So I never do that. If a response that a student gives, an Anglophone student gives a response in French, it's very halting. I'll smile my biggest smile, and I'll paraphrase I'll try to regurgitate what they said or reformulate what they've said for the benefit of all concerned. In terms of correcting work, I do think consciously or unconsciously I might, for immersion students who actually submit work in English, and I'd say it happens maybe 40%, or pardon me, for immersion students who submit work in French, and if I had to guess, I'd say it's about 40% of the time. If I'm aware of it, I consciously or unconsciously, I think I will be a little more flexible about little errors, that kind of thing. But I do the same in a course if I teach it in English, and it's a Francophone who has submitted something in English, and there are little errors here and there, but it's apparent that it was a Francophone who submitted it. I might offer a bit more flexibility there. So that's in general that's how, again, like Rémi said, I have no formal training in this kind of thing, but that's how the approach that I've developed informally over time. But the real work on that front, I leave to people like Alice, who are the experts in it.
So I'm the language teacher, and I'm the little red dot that was on the slides this morning, on Mark's slides, going to with the students, J'assiste à tous les cours d'histoire, parce que je me suis spécialisée en histoire, parce que c'est l'histoire qui m'intéresse. Donc, ça fait 10 ans que je suis différents cours d'histoire. And I'm assisting to all those courses. I take notes, like the students. I improve my notes over the years sometimes, and have different activities. And when I meet with the students, we're focusing on the course, and all courses, as I'm supposed to cover 2 courses in this 90-minute period of the adjunct language class. So I'm always basing myself on the courses, on the notes that we have been taking, and we're working on different aspects. We're working on strategies about taking notes in the class, helping the students, because the first time they're going to the class, they're just amazed, sometimes very frightened, then they don't understand what's going on. Even if they've taken French at high school, suddenly the context is so different that I'm working on with the strategy is building the confidence of the students, telling them, yes, you're going to succeed, and it's going to be easier next week or in 2 weeks. And by the end of the first month, of course, it's easier. Meanwhile, as we're working, and it all depends, because Robert is one prof, I'm another prof, but every team that we could have had here would be different. Some content professors will come with all their slides on PowerPoints. The listening experience is the comprehension is very different if a professor doesn't have any slides and give un cours magistral talking with no visual supports. So the students in that second case has to adapt differently than the one who has the slides can print them before even going to class and have all the schemata prepared and ready to understand more easily the course. So we're working on strategies, and we have, here. There is one of the elements working on taking notes, but that's one of the activity I build with my students, which is creating a wiki space for the students where I start putting on the notes that I've been taking for 1 week or 2 weeks, the first 2 weeks, and then the students are responsible, each of them, for every classes to take the notes, to put them on the wiki, to share them with the students, and then we can discuss it. So it's a tool there where I'm going to focus on the collaboration between students. We're going to talk a lot about collaboration, and that's one of my memo dada, but I'm going to go and refer to, for me, collaboration between the profs and between the student is a key element. They're all together in the same boat, and they are getting much more out of this experience. So that's what we're working on for taking notes and listening strategies. With Hélène, we've also had we created another tool for the students to help them to understand how to take better notes, how to become a better listener in the class. So there are different activities. Here is the the list of all the podcasts that we created for the immersion students, but it's used for the students. It could be used for the immersion students, but actually it could be used by any student starting university. How do I become a better listener in those cours magistraux? So that's some of the elements, but I can give you a lot of other examples. And I can talk it. I'm as passionate as the students. But one more thing, because I want to talk about building the vocabulary skills of the students. And because I've been doing some of those courses with one prof in particular, and even if I like Robert very much, there is Sylvie Perrier, who is the professor that I've worked since 2006, since last year. So we have something like 10 years experience. And I've been working with a student in this class, and the students were working on a vocabulary dictionary, their own vocabulary dictionary of words that they didn't know over the, no, I don't have a picture, no, over the years. And starting from that tool that the students provide me 1 year, the following year, I decided to focus on I picked up 50 words from the students, and I tested the students on 30 of them, and I said, okay, what do you know at the beginning of the year? This is la douche froide, because and even going back to the words that we've been talking about earlier, like hegemony, chômage, I know the vocabulary which is going to come over the history of the 5 centuries of history. And so I give them, I prepared a test with my colleague Sandy Berger, and we looked at how much did they know at the beginning. And usually the average is 3 out of 30 words. So they're saying, oh, here is a shock. And I tell them, you don't have to worry. It's not going to count as your mark, but we're going to focus on that vocabulary over the term. And by the end of the term, we did the same test, and by that time they have 27, 28, 29 out of 30. So they can see their progress and into grasping that vocabulary, that new vocabulary related to those specific courses. So those are two tools that I've been creating and working on, related to one specific history class. But in order to do this, I need some continuity. You can't arrive and build all those tests in one shot. You need to take the class a few times. You need to have a sense of the vocabulary, have a sense of the challenges for the students, and where can I help them, and how can I help them, for example, vocabulary or the wiki space for note-taking.
So if we go back to the idea of integrating language and content or knowledge, the K in the click, and the idea of collaboration between language prof and content prof or discipline prof, I'd like to hear your experiences about that.
there's one thing that I do in first year when the students come in, like I said earlier, 25 students, most of them from French Immersion. They take my Intro to Political Science course. Most of them have never taken political science before. There's no political science in high school in British Columbia, so this is very new material for them. And one of the things that I do in my course is that there's a lecture part and there's a tutorial part, and I run my own tutorials. And in my tutorials, we read a book, a French language book. That's about 140 pages. And that's very difficult for the students. But I do insist on them reading a book from cover to cover for a number of reasons. And it's a political science book, but the books that I choose, I've changed the books over the year. But just to give you an example, the original book that I used when I first got at SFU was Contre Harper, Against Harper. So it was a book that was, it was an engaging book that had an ideological bent. You can imagine what kind of bent it had, but written by a political scientist. And the book that I've used over the past couple of years is about Canadian foreign policy and how Canada participates in different international organizations. So anyway, this book is in French. It's about 130, 140 pages, and it's very difficult for the students. So what I've done is that I collaborate with one of the teachers that teaches a French language course to the same students during the same semester. And she also uses that book in her course. So in my course, I can actually focus on the poli-sci stuff, the political science stuff. And in her course, she can go over segments of the book and talk about vocabulary. I'm not trained in pedagogy or any of this stuff. I'm a political science teacher. So for me, what's important is that they learn the vocabulary about politics and the basics of political science, so then they can continue into more advanced political science courses. And the more language, and my colleague in French can focus on some questions that they may have about content and vocabulary, etc. But this is very much an informal collaboration that I've developed with one of my colleagues in the French department.
Okay, merci. In the education department, our students graduate with a bilingual degree, and so are highly sought after by the school districts in Western Canada to teach in the French immersion and Francophone programs. However, the school districts have come back to Campus Saint-Jean and said over and over again, you're granting them a bilingual degree, attesting to their French language skills, but their French competency is really not at the right level to teach French immersion, to teach French, to teach in a Francophone district. You've got to improve. So then we decided, well, if we want to improve their competency in French, then we have to have more than just, as a requirement, the completion of an advanced French class. And so we put into the education program the requirement that they would have to pass the DELF exam and achieve it at what we call B2 fort, which means they have to pass all 4 parts of that exam with a minimum of 18 out of 25 points. So you have to pass la production orale et écrite et compréhension et orale et écrite avec 18 sur 25. So then the students, we said that'll solve our problem and they will prepare for this exam. So then we had to put into place then in le centre bilingue some support classes to help them prepare for this. But still that was not enough because our failure rate at the DELF B2 fort was very high. So there was such a discrepancy between having achieved the highest level of French course that we were requiring them to do. They were achieving that exam. They were passing that course quite well, actually, but were failing the DELF B2 at the level that we were requesting. So then we said, well, okay, we have to align the French courses So the entire French department then sat down with us and said, okay, so if they're going to pass French 101, French 201, et cetera, we will align these courses along with the same requirements of the DELF program, so that by the time they do that last French course that we are requiring them to do, then that will align perfectly with B2 in the DELF program. And so that is what we are in the process of doing now, and it's our third year at that. We have seen some success, but there are certainly still some challenges. So we're looking at other possibilities of having them, we're encouraging them to go abroad. And we're very happy because our dean is going to also be at the session where they will be signing an agreement with post-secondary institutions abroad to welcome more of our students so that they can get that full French experience in other countries. So we're hoping that that will help. But also we are saying we have to do more within our content classes. So whether I'm teaching, how to teach math at the elementary level, I have to incorporate a greater part of my teaching in and dedicate that to the language, actually, language acquisition for my students. And so that's where we've started now is in asking the professors in the education department, okay, submit your syllabus and tell us, where are you going to integrate language and language learning within your teaching of your your actual subject matter? And so we're having to do that. We're behind many other institutions in Canada, but it's because of the need that is arising as our institution is now serving a very different public.
Merci. Robert, tu as déjà parlé un petit peu de l'aspect langue dans ton cours. Est-ce que tu avais d'autres choses à rajouter? Je sais que Alice a parlé beaucoup de ce qu'elle fait, mais est-ce que tu avais d'autres choses à dire sur ce que tu fais toi dans ta classe? Si tu fais d'autres choses que celles que tu as déjà mentionnées?
Avec la langue?
Oui.
Pas spécifiquement ça. En termes de collaboration sur cette question-là, ce que je trouve très utile, c'est d'avoir quelqu'un comme Alice dans la salle de classe qui peut... On se parle après, elle m'aide des fois avec mon français à moi, mais aussi avec des petits conseils. Par exemple, elle me dit qu'il y a certains étudiants en immersion française qui trouvent que tu parles un peu trop vite. Comme anglophone, je me dis, oh, ben c'est gentil que tu dis ça, parce que non, je ne m'attendais pas à ça. Mais alors, j'ai beaucoup aimé ça. Mais je me suis dit, OK, so some of the students find I'm speaking too quickly. It's possible, too, that some of the francophones find that I'm speaking too quickly. And so, les petits conseils comme ça sont très utiles, just to have someone in the audience who can speak to you frankly about how you could... They give you some constructive criticism on how you can improve the show. And so I very much appreciate that from Alice.
Moi, je vais juste, en fait, rapporter les paroles de Sylvie Perrier parce qu'elle fonctionne... elle avait dit, il y a 5 ans, les étudiants en immersion me permettent aussi d'améliorer mon enseignement, l'enseignement que je donne aux francophones. Je prends le temps d'expliquer des mots, pas simplement pour les étudiants en immersion, parce que sinon on revient à la même question que ce matin. Hégémonie, ils ne le connaissent pas plus en français qu'en anglais, mais elle va donner l'explication en français et en fin de compte répond aux besoins des étudiants francophones et des étudiants en immersion. Un autre élément que j'ai toujours trouvé très intéressant avec Sylvie, c'est que elle utilise le terme francophile, mais dans le sens que ce sont les étudiants qui aiment le français. C'est comme ça qu'elle perçoit le francophile, c'est quelqu'un qui aime le français et qui veut s'améliorer en français. Et elle dit aussi que pour qu'il s'améliore, si elle va tout faire, elle va leur donner les meilleures conditions pour qu'ils se sentent à l'aise. Dans le sens que, par exemple, pour la correction du français, on en a parlé ici à un moment, elle indique que les étudiants qui sont en immersion ne seront pas pénalisés s'ils décident d'écrire en français. Elle accorde un pourcentage très minime de sa note pour la correction en français. L'étudiant francophone, lui, n'est pas pénalisé. Elle est même allée plus loin. C'est la seule personne que j'ai rencontrée sur le campus qui disait même aux étudiants, si vous voulez écrire l'introduction en français, le reste du texte en anglais, faites-le. Je veux que, en fait, pour les pousser, pour les sensibiliser que oui, ils peuvent écrire en français, ils peuvent se sentir à l'aise pour aller écrire en français. Parce que sinon, les étudiants, la première réaction, ils disent « j'ai pas le temps. J'ai pas le temps d'écrire en français. » Donc, ils s'en vont et puis ils écrivent en anglais, puisqu'ils ont le droit d'écrire en anglais. Et elle se dit s'ils ont commencé par l'introduction, ils vont peut-être continuer dans un an à faire un peu plus en français. Donc là, c'est des outils qu'elle utilise en tant que professeur de la discipline pour favoriser, par exemple, cet écrit en français. Donc ça, c'était juste, c'est pas mon expérience, mais c'est l'expérience que je voulais rapporter d'un autre professeur de discipline.
On a déjà posé cette question tout à l'heure, mais on l'a posée aux étudiants. Je voudrais bien vous la poser à vous aussi. Your biggest successes and your biggest challenges as a content prof or a language prof in this wonderful adventure.
I mean, this is hard. I mean, you'd have to ask my students, but I think that the French language is not a barrier in my courses. I really try to depoliticize the French language, and I feel that most all of my students are engaged. They participate, whether at the 100, 200, 300, or 400 level. I teach at the undergraduate level. And some of the strategies that I've adopted, I've shared some of them with you. I don't think they're miraculous, or they're not really from doing a lot of research in this area. But my main goal is for the French language not to be a barrier. I want students to be engaged in their learning. I want students to be empowered in their learning, and if I have to allow a bit of English in the course, or if I have to make some adjustments or change my strategies, I think that's my main goal, is for them to be engaged and empowered in their learning. And overall, I think I'm doing an okay job, and so I think that's one of my successes since I've been at SFU for the past 5 years. As for my challenge, in my courses, I really consciously try never to use Francophone and Anglophone in my courses. It's very difficult for me to use those terms because the language competencies of the students are so varied, and some students that did immersion speak better French than I do, I think, and some students that came from the French language schools, their French is not as good in terms of the competencies that they have that some of the students that did immersion. And so for me to decide who's a Francophone and who's an Anglophone, I actually very much dislike the word Francophile because I think it's been deformed over the years in Canada. Francophile actually means the love of the language, and the way that we use it in Canada, we use it to mean you speak French as a second language. But anyway, that's my sense of the word Francophile. So, but that being said, I feel that in my courses, and I've heard that from some of my students that are the strongest in the French language do feel that my courses I don't tailor my courses to them because they're in the minority. My courses are mostly tailored to students who have French as a second language, students that have perhaps where French is a bit weaker. And so students that definitely have a dominant language, and that dominant language is French, often feel that my courses are going a bit too slow and that my courses are not tailored for them. And I don't really know how to what to do with that. The levels are just so varied, especially in first and second year. But I think that continues to be a challenge that I grapple with, and that I've grappled with over the last 5 years, is how to keep those students on board while keeping the students that are having difficulty in French on board as well. And where do you find the compromises there? That continues to be a challenge for me.
Merci. Simone?
In terms of successes, well, one of the great successes of the entire education department is that there is it's just a question of what's happening in Canada and French immersion and Francophone education, is there's such a demand for our students who graduate from our program, is that they know that they will get a job. In fact, they will often have several offers on the table and they will get to pick and choose. So I don't hide from them, however, in their fourth year, that before these employers are actually making offers to them, that they often speak to us and they ask us, their very first question is always, what's the level of French? Can they speak correctly? Can they read and write correctly? Are they completely bilingual and biliterate? And so I tell the students that right up front. And so I tell them, because you're going to be looking at contracts and being hired within the next few months because they're in their final year, I tell them, give me everything you want me to tell these employers about you. And I tell them that. And so I tell them, you know, the expectation is high. And I've never regretted that. They know that I will be watching them, will be listening to them during class, during group work, and during the breaks that I offer during my classes. Because I offer, the courses are offered over a 6-week period so that we can finish quicker and then let them do their practicum, which means that the courses are 3 hours long. So there are breaks that are set into the courses. And so during break time, I expect them to speak French as well. I at first have to remind them sometimes a little bit, and I sort of do it with humor, you know, going, français, s'il vous plaît, you know, kind of thing, or else I'll tell them, I am only going to expect of you what you will be repeating to your students in 6 weeks, because you will be telling your students, en français, s'il vous plaît, à parler français pour madame. You know, they're going to be encouraging their students to speak in French. So I tell them, practice it here. This is a safe environment for you to do that, and practice it here. But I insist on that a lot more than I used to, and I've never regretted that. And so I think that is one of the successes in being honest to them. What remains a challenge, obviously, is that the districts the districts who really are wanting to get better quality of French are telling us that they're having to recruit elsewhere than at Campus Saint-Jean, so are often coming to Ottawa, they're going to New Brunswick, they're going to Sudbury, they're going elsewhere. And so I tell my students that this is a challenge, that if they want to have the offers coming from almost every part of the province, and particularly right in Edmonton where we work, then that's what they have to live up to. And so it's their opportunity, their last chance to really improve on their language skills while they're here. They know they will all get a job, but those who can certainly perform easily in both languages know that they will be able to pick and choose from anywhere in the province and not have to say, well, I really wanted to teach in Edmonton or Calgary, the big cities, but I didn't get an offer, so I have to go 500 miles north in a small community, and, well, I'm not that happy about that, but that's what I get. Okay. And so they know that that's a challenge, and we know also that that's our challenge and that we have a responsibility in that role as well. So we're working on it, okay. And certainly coming to this place, to this symposium, I think is allowing me to bring back many ideas to some of my colleagues, and that's what I intend to do.
Merci.
I think for me, the biggest success is it's not owing to myself. It's more just the students themselves and their presence in the classroom. Just the fact that in a class, for example, a course taught in French, you know, there will be maybe a quarter of the students will be Anglophone. That they get a chance to show Francophones that yes, there are Anglophones outside Quebec who learn French. It's always interesting when the first Anglophone answers a question in class, and then they have a nice Anglophone accent like I do. You see all the Francophone students kind of turn around, and you can see the question on their face: where did that kid learn his French? And a lot of Francophones are aware of it, but I often have Francophone students from Quebec in particular coming up to me and being, I didn't even know French immersion existed. I didn't know that there was such a thing. So it's an opportunity. I think the success is just the opportunity for Francophones to see flesh and blood Anglophones who have learned French, and for Anglophones who have spent all these years learning French to finally meet and interact with flesh and blood Francophones. It's very rewarding after going through this, especially if you've grown up in a milieu that is entirely Anglophone. And it was the case for me, K to 12, doing French immersion, then, come to the University of Ottawa and I get to use to speak in French with real Francophones and with real Francophones. It's an enriching experience. So that is a success, but also for the teaching of history, just having people in the same room who are from different backgrounds is, I think, essential or very useful for the teaching of history. This past semester, I taught a course on Anglophone-Francophone relations, the history of Anglophone-Francophone relations in Canada. Of course, totally uncomplicated, right? And everybody has completely the same version of history. No, of course not, right? The past is the past. We study the same events, or some of the same events, but we all have very different interpretations of those events. And just the fact that in a room with many Francophones, Anglophone students can't make the same assumptions or sweeping statements about French Canada or about Quebec. And the obverse of that is that the Francophones, once they're aware that there are Anglophone kids in the class, I can't make those sweeping generalizations about Alberta or about Saskatchewan, or about English Canada, So it forces people to reflect, to think critically about the generalizations that they've made, because sitting there in the room with them is the exception to the rule that they have made in their head. And so
challenge? Biggest challenge? I guess I'm going to have to rush things a little bit.
Biggest challenge, it is always, of course, on se gêne quand on parle dans notre deuxième langue, et c'est toujours le cas pour beaucoup d'anglophones. I'd say about half the Anglophone immersion students participate very actively in conversation. The other half are very shy and don't. And I think that's to be expected. So that engaging them is a challenge, and of course in discussion group there's a temptation to hive yourself off with another Anglophone and to be in that safe space and to speak together. So one way that I've tried to address that is to, during periods of discussion, to talk with those students briefly and say, hey, in French, of course, to say, well, what's something that interested you? Maybe I'll ask you a question about that during the broader discussion period so that they feel mentally prepared to answer.
Merci. Alice, brièvement.
Brièvement. Juste, d'abord pour revenir à Robert, ce qui est très intéressant, j'ai accompagné des étudiants avec des professeurs dont la langue première était le français, la langue première était l'anglais, et Robert représente pour les étudiants, en fin de compte, le succès, ce qu'ils veulent atteindre. Parce qu'ils voient là un professeur qui vient de l'immersion en français et qui enseigne en français. Et pour eux, c'est vraiment le succès complet de ce qu'ils voudraient atteindre. Donc,
succès complet.
Oui. Et je me rappelle très bien ce cours-là. À la fin de la session, tous les étudiants ont applaudi. Donc ça, c'était vraiment aussi un succès du professeur de discipline. Pour moi, j'ai juste mentionné un seul point, qui est la collaboration. Ça a été mentionné hier dans la présentation de Marie. Et c'est pour ça, en fin de compte, que c'était intéressant, parce que c'est cet espace entre le professeur de discipline et de langue qui peut aboutir à de très belles collaborations si on a le temps, si on est professeur à temps complet, s'il y a la continuité, la stabilité de la relation. Alors pour moi, ça c'est une... Tu me regardes.
30 secondes.
C'est la réussite la plus complète quand on arrive à créer des outils, à créer des points en commun. Et ce qui a été le cas avec Sylvie Perrier, on a créé toutes les deux un site Internet pour les étudiants francophones, les étudiants anglophones, et qu'on utilise chaque fois qu'on peut donner le cours ensemble. Là, je fais un petit clin d'œil à Marc.
15 secondes.
En même temps, at the same time, it's also the biggest challenge, because if you don't have continuity, if you just have part-time, you receive the course and the schedule at the last minute, then this collaboration is very difficult to create. You don't have you cannot do this at the last minute. You need continuity. So that's one of the big challenge. And the collaboration could go at all the level, between the prof, between the students. And this we need also, this works with stability and long-term relationship. And I could keep talking, but I think
je sais.
No.
On a à peu près une dizaine de minutes pour les questions, mais d'abord je voudrais remercier nos 4 panélistes. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions, Catherine?
Oui, en fait, ma question, c'est pour Rémi. J'ai trouvé très intéressant votre commentaire par rapport à l'anglophone, le francophone, que ça se lit pas en classe. Puis là, il faut que je dise que mon mari vient de l'Ouest, so he defines himself as a Westerner. But then, you're teaching political science. And so then I was wondering, and then Robert alluded to it, if you go into all the tensions in your classes between, and then, pardonnez-moi, je lance la bombe, Quebec and the rest of Canada. Do you speak of that at all with your students?
Yeah, it's not that it's not written on the wall that there's a list of banned terms, and those terms include francophone and anglophone. Actually, I teach a class that's entitled Language Politics in Canada. That's my specialization, actually. I publish in this area. But what I mean by anglophone and francophone is that when I talk about students or the program that I teach in, I try not to use these labels because I think that they actually don't represent the student clientele. And in fact, my sense from the students is that, and some of the students alluded to that in the earlier panel, is that they don't really know how to use these terms either. But obviously, when I tell the story of language politics in Canada, we do have to acknowledge that there are people that speak French and people that speak English, and they've had a few issues over the years.
Just a few.
Yeah.
Another question, Marc?
En fait, c'est pour Rémi aussi que tu disais que dans ton cours, tu imposes la lecture d'un cours d'un livre de sciences politiques et que le prof de français utilise le même livre. De quelle façon est-ce que ce livre-là s'insère dans son curriculum, dans ses objectifs? Est-ce que vous vous entendez dès le début de la session? Est-ce que le cours de français a été adapté pour utiliser une ressource de sciences politiques?
Je ne suis pas clair si tu as plus de détails là-dessus.
L'idée, c'est justement parce que au premier trimestre, les étudiants ont 4 cours en français, dont cours de sciences politiques, et cours en français, qui soutiennent les cours de matière. Votre modèle, c'est 3 heures dans une matière et 1 heure et demie. Alors que nous, c'est ça?
C'est ça,
oui. Alors que nous, on a demandé à l'enseignant qui donne les cours du département français de tenir compte du contenu de la matière. Et ce cours-là, il va faire attention à la grammaire, le vocabulaire, etc. Donc l'idée, c'est de faire une mise à niveau mais de coller le contenu à une matière qui est enseignée. Alors, le semestre suivant, ça sera l'histoire, par exemple.
So it's not a language support class, but it's content-based teaching. Okay.
Mais ils sont en communication. Rémi est en communication avec le prof de français régulier toutes les semaines ou sporadique?
Ça, je sais pas. Ça détermine au début, là, je pense.
Like I said, it's very informal. It's an email that's sent, and now I've been there for a few years, so there's a relationship that's established, and so we email over the summer and say, hey, what book are you using this term? And I say, I'm using the same book. Oh, perfect. Last year I focused on this chapter and specifically and these kind of couple of paragraphs and these key terms. Do you think we should do the same thing? And I say, yeah, that sounds good. Actually, maybe next year you can focus on that. And then she just does her thing and I do my thing.
Formal and informal link. But you also work at preparing students for the Parlement jeunesse within that course also. So there is not a very tight connection, but there is connection.
Okay. qu'il y a une autre question, Maury?
Just wondering about textbooks, because you spoke about having all, French readings and so forth, and you teach a course in both languages. And I recall in our early experiment with the psychology courses, they had a textbook that was in both French and English, and so all the introductory courses, had one or the other. And that history was extremely difficult because everyone who taught history was giving you a different sheaf of writings, wanted essay tests and this and that. And I wonder what your situation is and how you deal with it.
I find, and other history profs' experiences might be different. Teaching history in English, history of Canada texts, there are dozens to choose from. I'd say a dime a dozen, but that's not true because they're all like $100. But there are many to choose from. In French, there are many books about the history of Quebec, many books about the history of Quebec and Canada. In French, books about the history of Canada in French are few and far between, in my experience. And so I find the selection is there's very little selection. A big challenge this English-French relations course that I taught history of, it was I wanted to give all the readings in French because I wanted to create that French language space for Francophone students in the class, especially. Finding readings in French that talked about also English Canada was it was the biggest challenge in prepping that course. I didn't bother with a textbook because I couldn't find one that I was satisfied with. Instead, I put together a series of readings myself, and it was a real challenge finding works in French that dealt with both sides in a way that was somewhat fair, I guess. Both sides make generalizations about the other, and so that's something that I think the historiography could improve on.
Je vais juste rajouter un petit mot pour les cours d'histoire. Donc, des fois, ça dépend des cours, ça dépend des contenus, mais très souvent, il y a quand même ce qui revient le plus souvent, c'est que en français, on risque d'avoir des manuels qui viennent de France et qui sont à un niveau beaucoup trop élevé pour les étudiants. Des manuels, par exemple, qui servent à la préparation de l'agrégation en histoire en France. Donc, ça n'a rien à voir avec un étudiant qui arrive en première année. Donc, you could either go for this, or if you go sometimes for des polycopiés from articles, then the approach is very different from French and English. So those documents are extremely difficult for students to read in French. And there is no English translation of those texts. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you again to all our four panelists. Thank you also for asking those questions. Well, we're going to stop here, but there is a 10-minute break with coffee and cookies. So if you have more questions, you can ask our panelists over a cup of coffee. And then we'll have our last plenary session with Xavier Villa at 10 to 4 if everything goes well.